took it by yesterday.
The Virginia Cable Telecommunications Association and your local cable provider presents Cable Reports. Join us now as Cable Reports brings you up to date on current issues facing the Commonwealth through discussions with your local legislators and other policymakers from across Virginia.
From the General Assembly and the City of Richmond, I'm Woody Evans for Cable Reports, brought to you by the Virginia Cable Telecommunications Association and Cox Communications, connecting Virginians to their government. We're pleased to have Senator Lynwood Lewis with us today. Welcome, sir.
Thanks, Woody. Thanks for having me.
Now, you represent the 6th District. I believe you live in Accomack.
Live in Accomack.
Talk to us a little bit about your district. It's very diverse, is it not?
Very diverse, very challenging, and very large. I have the two counties on Virginia's eastern shore. I come across the Chesapeake Bay Bridge Tunnel and pick up one precinct in Virginia Beach, Chicks Beach Precinct. Then I go in to take about half the city of Norfolk and then go up to the Middle Peninsula where I have Matthews County.
So you spend all the weekend traveling your district in order to see constituents.
It is a lot of time spent on the road, yes indeed.
Now, what about your committee assignments? I think you're still on agriculture, are you not?
Agriculture, natural resources, which is a tremendously important committee for all the district. I'm on local government, which obviously takes up some issues of import for local governments and establishes sort of the rules under which local governments operate, the powers that they have. We're a Dillon Rule state, so we sort of decide which powers local governments have. So we spend a lot of time with that. And I'm also on the Health and Education Committee, which is a very important committee with a robust docket. So very important committees and glad to have them all.
I don't think most people understand how huge an economic driver agriculture is. Talk to us about that.
Tremendous industry. Ag and forestry combined is a tremendous part of Virginia's economy. And so when we consider issues, and particularly now the governor has vowed in his very competitive way to increase Virginia's ranking in agricultural exports. And so there are always a host of programs and endeavors out there to try and improve agriculture and make it it is a viable, but even more important part of our economy. I've got a budget amendment in this year too, because agriculture figures prominently in our efforts to clean the bay, to increase best management practices funding, cost share funding for Virginia farmers.
And obviously tourism is a big economic driver in your district as well.
Tremendous in all parts of the district, from Matthews to the eastern shore. Tourism is a huge part of our region and our district's economy.
Now, I take it that with the huge reduction in gas prices, you're probably getting a few more people in for tourism.
Tourism has been great. The traffic counts have been good. We're looking forward to an even better, with continued low gas prices, a continued better season this season. Plus the economy is better. People feel better. And I think people feel like they can travel and spend a little more money. So it's good all the way around.
Now, on the other hand, it's had a negative impact on the ability of the state to raise revenue for transportation needs.
Right. Hampton Roads has a real problem. From a fundamental standpoint, the bill that we passed a couple of years ago, the Omnibus Transportation Funding Bill, neglected to put a floor on the regional gas tax. We had a floor on the state gas tax, but we didn't put a floor on the regional gas tax. I think it was a drafting error. Unfortunately, that's costing us about $20 million a year in revenue for the Hampton Roads region. Yes. So there's a bill out there to fix it. There is some doubt whether there is the political appetite, particularly in the House, to take that step, which is unfortunate again because it was largely, I think everyone else concedes a drafting error, but it's very important to our region. In addition to that, the funding stream is shorter than we had imagined for a variety of reasons, and so we're going to be considerably behind in the revenues necessary to build the large Big 8 projects that we have on the table. If we don't do something to address this funding shortfall, what we're going to find is that these projects are going to be built out in 2080 as opposed to 15 or 20 years from now. So.
And I take it there's little or no appetite for tolling. I mean, there's been a lot of controversy around tolling.
Nobody likes tolls, and they are in fact regressive. They hit the working man a lot harder, the working man in Hampton Roads in particular, because there are so many bodies of water and tunnels that we have to traverse for people to go to and from. A recent study by ODU, I think, found that 40 or 50% of the folks don't work in the city in which they live in Hampton Roads. So there's a lot of commuting that goes on there. I think it's going to be an all of the above because these projects are so huge and so costly. I think tolling is going to be an inevitable part in some form or fashion of what we do. But we've got to look at these revenues that are coming into the Hampton Roads Transportation Accountability Commission because they are far short of what we had envisioned.
Now, Wallops Island is also in your district. Tell us about the importance of that institute.
Very important to the Commonwealth's future, economic future, not only to the district and the region, but to the Commonwealth's future as we look towards weaning ourselves off Department of Defense dollars. This offers an opportunity for private space flight, private and commercial space launches into space. We've got one customer now, a big customer, Orbital, which is based in Northern Virginia, so it's a Virginia company that we had a somewhat of a disaster there with the mission fail last year, but we're going to be up and running and expect to have a hot fire test on the new pad in March and probably another launch to the International Space Station by June.
Now, another part of your economic base there is menhaden fish.
Right.
What are they and why are they so important?
The menhaden is a tremendously important fish on many levels. It's important to the ecology of the bay. They're filter feeders and they're important in the food chain of the bay. But also they're important commercially because we have a reduction harvest out there, omega protein based in Reedville, that harvests large amounts of these fish commercially. There has always been, I've been here, this is my 12th General Assembly session, and we have always talked about, sometimes more hotly than others, menhaden and who should regulate the menhaden fishery. This year I signed on as a co-patron of a bill that would shift the regulatory authority from the General Assembly over to the Virginia Marine Resources Commission. The menhaden fishery is the only fishery that the General Assembly, as a legislative body, regulates. Everything else is regulated by the Virginia Marine Resources Commission. I think it is time that we shifted that authority over. I think they have the staff, the expertise, and I just think it's fitting and proper that they regulate that fishery.
Now, there's a new concept based upon an old idea that was brought to the General Assembly this year by private industry, and that's Go Virginia. Talk to us about that concept and why it's important.
I have just come this morning from the Senate Finance Committee where Go Virginia legislation was presented to the committee. We had a number of business leaders from across the state there, and it is a product of some of their thoughts and thinking about how we better do things on a regional basis. There's been a lot of parochialism in the way localities compete for, try to attract business. This Go Virginia initiative, which the governor funded at a significant level in his budget, offers incentives for regional cooperation on economic development projects. And I think it's going to be, the word game changer was used significantly or a number of times this morning in the committee hearing, but I don't think that's an exaggeration. I think it will be a game changer.
So these proposals will come from the bottom versus the top. They will go through local councils, then some type of regional review, and then ultimately to the state.
There will be a state board comprised of legislators and business leaders and members of the administration, which will vet the projects as they come up from the regional boards. The regional areas, there will be 8 to 10 regions across the Commonwealth. Not necessarily they will not necessarily follow the existing planning district commission regions, but there will be regions from across the Commonwealth. And they will identify their region's priorities and then look for projects which fit in with those priorities.
So I take it now there isn't enough cooperation between the localities on a regional basis, and that's why they need to be encouraged.
No, and we hear, or I have heard horror stories from local governments who have competed with other local governments that they offer their incentives or packages to these particular economic development projects, and then the state has to stand by and wait to see which locality is the favored one in the competition, and then they can come in and offer the state incentives at that point. It's just a real inefficient application of resources and an inefficient approach to economic development. We have to realize in Hampton Roads that an economic development project in Norfolk can benefit the beach and vice versa. And once we get that psychology mindset broken, and Go Virginia is going to give us incentives to do that, I think we can really see some economic development strides.
Now, you mentioned Menhaden legislation, but I know you have quite a bit more. There's legislation on Virginia shoreline in terms of a resiliency fund. Talk to us about that.
Right. We're pleased that has passed through the Agricultural and Natural Resources Committee unanimously. It has just passed through the Senate Finance Committee unanimously, so it'll be headed to the floor of the Senate and then on to the House, hopefully on to the House. This seeks to establish a low-interest revolving loan fund in Virginia for frequently flooded properties due to sea level rise primarily. And it is tremendously important to the Hampton Roads region. It is important, as I told the Senate Finance Committee, that we lay down a marker as a Commonwealth to let all companies in the Department of Defense included know that we are treating sea level rise seriously. We have the largest population endangered by sea level rise outside of New Orleans in the entire country.
Repeat that.
The largest population endangered by sea level rise, second only to New Orleans in the entire country. So it's important as we seek to encourage expansion of existing businesses or lure other businesses here. That's no secret about our sea level rise issue. We have to let them know that we are being proactive in treating this seriously.
So the same need for beach restoration, because you have a bill on that as well.
Right, and that is going to expedite it directs the Virginia Marine Resources Commission to expedite permits for beach replenishment projects that have occurred. It has to have occurred due to a discrete weather event or events, nor'easter, and also has to be associated with a declaration of emergency by the governor. And what that seeks to do is when we have extreme weather events such as Sandy, Hurricane Sandy, or a bad nor'easter, that we can go in there and get a quick permit to do beach replenishment so that another weather event won't come along and then do significant property damage.
Now, what about the Department of the Interior? How do our state laws work with those federal requirements?
We have a real issue, and I had a bill in this year which is advancing through the Assembly, which again centers on the VMRC and directs them to pay attention to, in particular, the area of Tom's Cove adjacent to the Astig National Seashore, where the Department of Interior is seeking to invoke its jurisdiction, which we think intrudes upon state jurisdiction insofar as the aquaculture and commercial fishing activities which are going on there and have been going on there for generations.
Now, you've also been a leader in terms of the redistricting process that we currently have in the state, and I know you're pursuing that once more. We've had a decision out of the courts, at least the federal courts, that have sort of upset the apple cart in terms of congressional districts. What would your legislation do?
My legislation would adopt the Iowa model for redistricting reform, and that is it completely removes the drawing of the legislative and congressional district maps from the legislature and places it with our Division of Legislative Services, which is a completely nonpartisan, largely career-oriented group of folks, mostly lawyers, although not all lawyers. And it directs them to obviously follow constitutional and federal court criteria in drawing new districts, but also specifically prohibits them from considering the address of any incumbents and any political data from past elections in the way they configure these maps. So vitally important. This is a huge issue for our Commonwealth.
Now, there's always a lot of resistance to that concept. Part of it is people just don't want to give up their power and authority.
Right, and that's human nature, and I understand that. But the dysfunction that we see in Washington is gradually creeping into Virginia, and the root cause of that dysfunction, I contend, and many others agree on both sides of the political aisle, is the fact that we have technology, as it has in so many facets of our life, has outpaced our ability to deal with it. And the technology used in drawing these districts is so sophisticated now that we end up picking our voters as legislators, and that is not at all the way our system was intended to work.
So what do you see in terms of a prognosis for that effort?
Well, it's going to continue to meet resistance, particularly in the House of Delegates, but I think it is important that we continue to beat that drum. The grassroots uproar, I think, or support for redistricting reform is growing and continues to grow. Next round of redistricting will occur after the 2020 census in the 2021 legislative session. So it's coming upon us, and we've got some time, but we need to turn the heat up.
I want to go back to the economy for a moment because we were talking about Norfolk earlier, and of course the Port of Virginia is a huge economic driver. The widening of the Panama Canal has given us even more opportunity. We have to maintain our competitive advantage. Why don't you talk about the necessity of doing that?
Oh, absolutely important. As we hear and we all talk about now the new Virginia economy as we seek to wean ourselves off of our overdependence on Department of Defense and federal spending dollars. Key to that is expanding our natural advantages with our ports, with the Virginia ports. We have a $350 million capital improvement project for expansion of the Norfolk terminal and other improvements to our port facility in the budget, or in the governor's proposed budget this year. If we act now and we act decisively, and that $350 million is a part of what we need to do, we can capture a large part of this new trade that's coming as a result of the expansion of the Panama Canal. But we have to do that, and we have to be very proactive about it. I think there's large bipartisan support because I think everybody recognizes that this is a fantastic economic development opportunity for the entire Commonwealth.
Because other ports are increasing their depths, like New York, I believe, Charleston, South Carolina, and others, so it's important for us to maintain that competitive advantage.
Absolutely. They are being very aggressive in their attempts to catch up and to deepen their channels going into their ports. We have a God-given gift here, and so we have to make the best of it and improve upon it as best we can.
Well, how important is rail when you look at the port? We've got the inland port in Front Royal, Virginia. We've got the Port of Richmond. Those goods have to be distributed some way. I know a lot of trucks distribute those goods, but I take it that rail can do it more efficiently and at a larger volume.
Rail can, and rail is obviously an integral part of our whole delivery system when we talk about the port. We made a significant investment partnering with rail a few years ago with the Heartland Corridor to give us a pathway into the Midwest markets, and so that's been very important to the development of the port. And rail will continue to be an integral and important part of how we develop our port.
Now, what about the Chesapeake Bay and the necessity to maintain it as a clean and pristine waterway?
Well, in our obligation, I think, is twofold. I think incumbent upon us as citizens is a stewardship obligation. It is a national treasure. It is a great natural resource, and I think we have an obligation to leave it in as good or better shape than we found it. We have made significant efforts driven by a declaration, executive declaration from the President a number of years ago that we're going to clean up the bay. So we have that stewardship obligation, which is a moral obligation, but apart and beyond that, we have an obligation for economic development purposes. The bay is vitally important to our whole economic development structure here in the Commonwealth for tourism, commercial fishing, a whole host of endeavors. And so we're under the gun, and we have milestones to meet. 2017 is going to be a time when our paper is graded as to the progress we've made, and so we have to set about showing a seriousness of purpose on this.
You mentioned Old Dominion University in some of your opening remarks. We have a wealth of institutions of higher learning, but we have to get our youngsters there. I mean, K through 12 has to be critically important. I know the governor has additional funding in for K through 12, our high schools and our other institutions. Why is that funding so important?
Well, K through 12 provides the fundamental, again, it's somewhat similar to the Bay. We have a moral obligation to educate our children, but it's how we secure our future by educating our kids. So it's important that we not only provide them with the education, but that it's an education that meets the needs of our growing and changing economy. and the governor's very concerned about that. It's going to cost us about $450 million just to re-benchmark this year. That means just to keep the existing educational programs K through 12 current with the increase in average daily membership, number of students, and the cost of these programs. But we have to go beyond that. We also have to look to a way to expand access to quality pre-K programs, because that's going to be key going forward. Every industrialized nation has found a way to do that, and we are far below our other international competitors in providing access to our kids to quality pre-K programs.
Now, the governor's budget in its second year, I believe, calls for an increase in pay for teachers. It also calls for an increase in pay for state employees. But in terms of teachers, does that present a challenge to local school districts because there has to be a match?
There has to be a match. We can only fund, and all we do is fund the state's portion of the pay increase. So it does. And the state, the recent Legislative Audit and Review Committee study of the state funding of standards of quality, which are within the state's constitution. That is our basic, bare bones minimum for a strong education, what we think is necessary for a strong education. And it found that the state is a woefully inadequate partner in the funding of our standards of quality. And so we have got to, and the governor's recognized that, and we have got to beef up our commitment to be partnering with our local governments on a whole host of educational funding issues.
Now, are you still hearing from parents, teachers, and even students about the standards of learning? I know that there have been reforms instituted. Apparently more reforms are necessary, but I assume that that's an issue important to you and your constituents as well.
Absolutely. I was pleased to be a part of a number of the reform efforts last year in the standards of learning. Continue to be supportive of other reforms going forward. I think it was important to note that prior to this General Assembly session, No Child Left Behind was replaced with Every Child Succeeds. So there's been a recognition at the national level that there were some inadequacies in these high-stakes testing that we were relying on. And so I expect we will see additional positive reforms going forward to our standards of learning so that teachers can be freed up to teach.
Now, what about school discipline? Some suggest that there has been an uptick, a significant uptick in school suspensions. School resource officers may not have the discretion they deserve in order to deal with students in the classroom versus referring them to juvenile court, let's say.
Right. And we need to be cognizant of that fact, but we also need to be aware that we have an obligation to educate all kids. And there are going to be disciplinary problems, and we have to figure out an efficient way to handle that is respective of everyone's rights. But at the same time, we have to, first and foremost, create an environment where the kids who want to learn can learn, and that's what we're concerned about.
Now, what about charter schools? I think there's a constitutional amendment that would take away the authority to create those schools from a local school district to the State Board of Education.
Right, and I think that would be a mistake. I think we need to make as many local education decisions locally as we possibly can. There has not been, to my knowledge, a hue and cry about the need for more charter schools out there. We have, I think, only 8 in the Commonwealth, and I think we need to make those decisions locally. We have a large number. We have governor schools, we have magnet schools, we have all sorts of innovative means out there within the confines of the existing public school structure. And I think we need to be aware of that. I think we also need to look at the reforms that these charter schools want to put in place, because if they're good for charter schools, I think a number of them are good, and I think a number of them ought to be applied to our public school system.
And homeschooling still remains a big issue for some of our citizens, and I see once more that the Tim Tebow initiative has passed both the House and the Senate.
It did, and last year I have, for a number of years now, been in opposition to what has been known as the Tebow bill. Last year, the proponents of the bill changed it somewhat and made it local option. And so last year was the first year that I supported it, and it was an identical bill introduced this year and supported it again. And the idea being that with the proliferation of elected school boards, if there is a locality out there that has a large number of homeschool kids within it, and that school board thinks that they can come up with a responsible way to address those kids and their desire to play these sports, then I think they should have that opportunity, and I think they should be accountable to their voters for it.
Now, what about a new paradigm for our high schools, more of a focus on certifications, technical training versus the academics?
For a long time, we have ignored the value of technical education. within the last 3, 4, 5 years, I think in the Commonwealth as policymakers, and I think with educational folks in general, more folks have finally realized that there is value to giving these kids vocational education and certifications at the high school level. And so we've, from a workforce training standpoint, so we've gone down that road, and I think that's a good road for us to go down.
And of course, we have a wealth of community colleges that provide those opportunities now as well.
Absolutely, and the community colleges are an integral part. You know, couple of years ago, we directed that the community colleges enter into agreements with the local school boards for combined studies and combined credit programs, and so I think that's been a very big step forward in workforce development and educational opportunities for our kids.
And there's a similar agreement, if you will, with our institutions of higher learning, the 2+2 program.
Yeah, and again, an important part of how we educate our kids and the opportunities we give them.
Now, we also have a lot of veterans, I think close to 800,000 veterans in the Commonwealth, and we have many of them now returning from theaters of war. The community colleges present them with opportunities to get credit for experiences they've had abroad.
Absolutely, and I sponsored a bill a number of years ago to provide, directing SHEV, State Council of Higher Education, to come up with criteria about how we can give our veterans credit for their workforce, for their work training during their military service, and also for their experience during their military service. So I think we've got a great untapped resource there with these folks coming back with this great training. And we need to really make sure that they can fully exploit the training that they have, and that we can fully help them do that.
How is the Triple V program progressing, the Virginia Values Veterans?
Virginia Values Veterans program is, I think, going great guns. Last year I partnered with Senator Toddy Puller, Senator Bryce Reeves, and Senator Walter Stosh to provide a grant program to really beef up participation in the V3 program. And that grant program was on a trial, but it was initially proposed on a full-time basis, was adopted into the budget as on a part-time basis to encourage small employers to hire veterans, to help them figure out how they can put veterans into their small business and how they can go about to recruit and hire veterans, and that's been a success.
And I believe there, in the budget this year, there are new sites for 2 training centers, service centers for veterans, one in Hampton Roads,
One in Hampton Roads, yes, absolutely. And again, as you indicated, we have a large veteran population here. We have an obligation to them for their service, and I'm glad that Virginia is taking the lead on doing that.
Now, judges, especially Supreme Court appointees, have been the subject of discussion this session. What's going on in terms of the process that's used and what's likely to happen now?
Well, the resolution to address the seat currently occupied by Justice Roush continues to be carried over every day. I think on the other side of the aisle there is some disagreement as to how to handle Justice Roush. Justice Roush is an excellent jurist. She has had a brilliant career on the bench prior to her elevation to the Supreme Court, and she, by all reports, is an excellent, thus far during her tenure on the Supreme Court has been excellent, and I think she needs to stay there. She's an excellent Supreme Court justice.
Great. Well, Senator Lynwood Lewis, thank you for being here today.
Thank you, Woody.
Thank you for watching Cable Reports, brought to you by the Virginia Cable Telecommunications Association and Cox Communications. Until next time, I'm Woody Evans. Mm-hmm.